My name is Stella. I am 30 years old, and until last Tuesday, I allowed my arrogant husband to believe he was a self-made tech billionaire. I stood in the checkout line at a crowded Whole Foods in downtown Seattle, staring at the cashier as she loudly announced, my credit card had been declined over a $9.18 gallon of organic milk. When I called my husband for help, he put me on speakerphone during his executive board meeting just to humiliate me. His spoiled teenage daughter even chimed in to call me a worthless leech. They thought they were teaching me a lesson about budgeting. They had no idea they had just authorized their own absolute financial execution. Before I tell you how I dismantled his entire fake empire before lunch, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to remind a toxic partner exactly who holds the real power. The morning started like any other in my meticulously managed life. I had dressed in my usual plain beige sweater and comfortable jeans, driving my beat-up 2012 Honda Civic to the grocery store. I worked as a freelance data archivist, a job Preston loved to mock at dinner parties because it sounded incredibly boring compared to his flashy software startup. We had been married for 3 years, and in that time, Preston had transformed from a charming entrepreneur into a financially abusive tyrant. He tightly controlled every dollar I spent from our joint account, constantly gaslighting me about my spending habits, while he leased a new Maserati every single year. I endured his condescension patiently because I knew a secret. The cashier swiped my card again. The terminal beeped aggressively. The woman behind me, dressed head to toe in designer athletic wear, sighed loudly and shifted her weight. The cashier looked at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance, stating loudly that the issuer had restricted the account. My cheeks flushed hot. I stepped out of the line, leaving my groceries on the conveyor belt, and pulled out my phone. I dialed Preston. I knew he was in a morning board meeting pitching a massive merger to some East Coast investors, but this was an emergency. He answered on the third ring. Preston immediately informed me he was in the middle of a quarterly review. His voice echoed slightly, meaning he had placed me on speakerphone in the glass-walled conference room. He loved performing for his audience. I informed him that my card was just declined at the grocery store, keeping my voice perfectly level despite the public embarrassment. I explained I was trying to buy milk and breakfast supplies for his daughter, asking if he could unlock the account. A chorus of deep masculine chuckles echoed through the phone. Preston laughed, a sharp, patronizing sound that made my stomach churn. He proudly admitted he froze it on purpose. He accused me of spending way too much on useless groceries and insisted I needed to learn how to budget. He claimed they were running a lean operation and complained about me swiping the card endlessly, commanding me to be financially responsible. Before I could respond, another voice cut through the speaker. It was Mackenzie, his 18-year-old daughter from his previous marriage. Preston had hired her as a paid summer intern, which essentially meant she sat in the corner of the boardroom, browsing social media and collecting a massive paycheck. Mackenzie sneered, demanding I ask permission before spending another dollar of her dad's money. She accused me of not contributing anything to the family and demanded I stop trying to drain his wealth just because of my pathetic archive job. The board members chuckled again. Preston did not reprimand her, he never did. He simply cleared his throat, adopting his fake CEO persona. He agreed with her, telling me he would unlock a $50 limit tomorrow, only if I proved I actually needed it. He then dismissed me, stating he needed to get back to building his company and ordering me not to call again during business hours. The line went dead. I stood silently near the floral section, the dial tone ringing. I slipped my phone into my pocket, walked past the cashier without a word, and exited the sliding glass doors into the crisp Seattle morning. I got into my old Civic, gripped the steering wheel, and took a deep, stabilizing breath. Preston thought he was the ultimate master of our universe. He thought his startup, which had magically received $12 million in anonymous seed funding 5 years ago, was the result of his sheer brilliance. He did not know that the anonymous angel investor was me. I had inherited a massive private equity trust from my late grandfather, a ruthless industrialist who taught me everything about stealth wealth and corporate strategy. When I met Preston, I wanted a genuine connection. I hid my fortune, presenting myself as a simple archivist. When his company was failing, I used a blind trust to inject the capital he desperately needed, making my firm the 85% majority shareholder of his entire operation. I gave him the world, and he used it to treat me like garbage. I pulled out of the grocery store parking lot and bypassed the exit for our neighborhood. Instead, I drove straight into the heart of the downtown financial district. I pulled my battered car into the VIP underground parking garage of a towering glass skyscraper. The valet, who recognized me instantly, despite my casual clothes, rushed to open my door. I took the private elevator directly to the 40th floor, bypassing the grand reception desk of Vanguard Holdings, and walked straight into the corner office of Oliver, my high-power wealth management attorney. Oliver was a 55-year-old legal shark who had managed my family trust for a decade. He looked up from his mahogany desk, pushing his silver reading glasses down his nose as I entered. I did not bother sitting down. I stood in front of his desk, my voice devoid of any emotion, and ordered him to execute the clawback clause. Oliver froze. He slowly closed the file he was reading and looked at me with a sharp, calculating gaze. He asked if I was absolutely certain, warning that initiating the protocol would trigger a total asset freeze. He explained we would collapse his operating capital, lock his personal accounts, and initiate a hostile takeover of the board, resulting in a total corporate bloodbath. I crossed my arms, explaining. Preston had just declined my card over milk, while allowing his daughter to call me a leech before his board of directors. He wanted to teach me a lesson about budgeting. It was time I taught him a lesson about ownership. I commanded Oliver to freeze everything and leave him without a single dime. A predatory smile spread across Oliver's face. He picked up his desk phone, pressed a single button, and instructed his legal team to initiate the Vanguard takeover protocol for Preston's holdings. He ordered them to liquidate the corporate guarantees on all personal luxury leases, freeze all executive credit lines, and send immediate audit notices to his banking partners. We were pulling the plug. For the next 2 hours, I sat in Oliver's office drinking premium sparkling water while his team of corporate lawyers dismantled Preston's entire life. We signed the necessary documents, releasing the veil of the blind trust. I officially stepped out of the shadows as the absolute majority shareholder. We revoked the corporate guarantees that funded Preston's lavish lifestyle, his luxury cars, and the lease on our waterfront penthouse. I watched the legal machinery grind his ego into dust. By the time I finished my second glass of water, my cell phone screen lit up. Preston's name flashed across the glass. I let it ring. It stopped, then immediately started ringing again. Within 10 minutes, I had 55 missed calls from my husband, followed by a barrage of frantic, unhinged text messages. He demanded to know what was going on, complaining his black card declined at a restaurant. He panicked that the corporate accounts were frozen, and the bank claimed our primary investor initiated a hostile lockdown, ordering me to call him. He added that Mackenzie called crying because her shopping carts were bouncing. I read the messages with cold satisfaction. I typed a simple reply stating I was just following his advice by managing our budget and cutting out useless expenses, ending with a promise to see him at home. I thanked Oliver and took the elevator back down to the garage. The drive back to the penthouse felt entirely different than my morning commute. The heavy burden was finally gone. They had confused my silence for weakness and my humility for poverty. Now, they were going to learn the true cost of their endless arrogance. I smiled to myself, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Oliver placed a thick stack of legal documents on the polished mahogany desk. The heavy parchment paper felt cool beneath my fingertips. This was not a sudden act of revenge. This was a meticulously crafted safety net I had woven 5 years ago. I stared at the bold print at the top of the page. Vanguard Holdings Master Investment Agreement. When I first met Preston, his tech startup was bleeding cash. He was a desperate man with a flashy pitch deck and a mountain of impending debt. He had no idea the silent angel investor who swooped in to save his miserable company was his new girlfriend. I used a blind trust to inject $12 million into his failing enterprise. I legally became the 85% majority shareholder. I allowed him to retain 15% and the meaningless title of Chief Executive Officer. He got the magazine covers and the massive ego boost. I got absolute, unquestionable control over his entire professional existence. Now I picked up the heavy gold pen Oliver offered me. I signed my name on the authorization forms, officially piercing the veil of the blind trust. I was no longer a silent partner. I was the executioner. Oliver watched me with a sharp professional intensity. He confirmed the transfer of voting rights was complete. He warned me that Preston would lose access to everything within the hour. I told him that was exactly the timeline I wanted. Oliver tapped a complex command into his secure computer terminal. The digital assault began instantly. I sat back and watched his dual monitors as the financial dashboard for his company turned red. Oliver initiated the emergency shareholder audit protocol. This legal mechanism immediately locked down all corporate operating capital. I listened to Oliver instruct his senior paralegal to contact the banking partners. They terminated the corporate guarantees shielding the personal luxury leases. His exclusive black cards, his platinum travel accounts, and his limitless expense accounts were instantly frozen. The bank was legally obligated to halt all outbound wire transfers. Preston could not buy a simple cup of coffee using company funds. Oliver leaned back in his leather chair, a ruthless smile playing on his lips. He informed me that the notification had just hit the executive server. The startup board of directors was receiving an automated alert that an external auditor was taking over the entire financial infrastructure. Preston was essentially locked out of his own castle. The immense satisfaction washing over me was indescribable. I had spent 3 years listening to him brag about his self-made billions, while he relentlessly micromanaged my grocery list. I thanked Oliver, grabbed my coat, and took the private elevator down to the underground parking garage. My phone was already vibrating with furious texts, but I completely ignored them. I climbed into my old car and merged onto the busy highway, heading straight for the waterfront penthouse I secretly owned. The drive to our luxury building took exactly 20 minutes. I handed my keys to the confused valet and rode the glass elevator to the top floor. Before I even unlocked the heavy oak door, I could hear Preston screaming. His voice echoed down the marble hallway, thick with blind panic and unhinged rage. I pushed the door open and stepped into the sprawling living room. Preston was pacing wildly in front of the massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Seattle skyline. His face was a sickly shade of pale gray, completely drained of his usual arrogant swagger. He clutched his phone so tightly his knuckles were stark white. I was screaming at a bank representative, demanding to speak to the regional manager immediately. He shouted that he was a vital client and threatened to sue the entire institution for gross negligence. I quietly closed the door behind me and leaned against the sleek entryway console. Preston ended the call by violently throwing his phone onto the plush white sofa. He looked up and saw me standing there. His eyes were wide with a frantic, unhinged energy. He charged toward me, pointing an accusing finger directly in my face. He yelled that my pathetic bad luck had entirely ruined his day. He explained that he was at the luxury car dealership, trying to purchase a brand new sports car for his daughter. He was standing in front of the sales manager when all 4 of his premium credit cards were abruptly declined. The dealer had actually laughed at him and asked if he needed a basic financing plan. Preston was humiliated beyond measure, screaming that someone had hacked his accounts and the bank was refusing to unlock his money. Before I could respond to his frantic outburst, Mackenzie stormed out of her spacious bedroom. She wore a designer robe and a face full of smeared expensive makeup. She stomped her bare feet on the hardwood floor and threw a massive tantrum right in front of us. She shrieked that the dealership had refused to give her the keys to the shiny new vehicle. She blamed Preston for embarrassing her in front of her wealthy friends, who had come to watch the extravagant purchase. Then she turned her venomous glare toward me. Mackenzie marched across the room and violently kicked my worn leather work bag, sending my private notebooks and pens skidding across the polished floor. She screamed that I was a pathetic curse on their perfect family. She demanded I get on my knees, pick up my trash, and figure out a way to make myself useful for once. She yelled that I should call my cheap local bank and transfer whatever pathetic savings I had to cover her massive car deposit. Preston immediately agreed with his spoiled daughter. He grabbed my shoulder, his grip uncomfortably tight and painful, and ordered me to log into my portal and wire him $10,000 immediately to fix the so-called glitch. He claimed he would pay me back tomorrow when his accounting team sorted out the temporary mess. He blamed me for standing there like an idiot while his magnificent life was supposedly falling apart. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or shed a single tear. I calmly reached down and pulled his hand off my shoulder, peeling his fingers away with cold precision. I stepped over the mess Mackenzie had made of my belongings and walked straight into the master bedroom. I pulled a single black duffel bag from the spacious closet and began packing my plain clothes. Preston followed me into the room, his immense confusion morphing into a seething rage. He demanded to know what I thought I was doing. He asked if I was running away just because things got a little stressful. He mocked me, claiming I was too weak to handle the intense pressure of living with a high-net-worth individual. I folded my sweaters, neatly zipping the duffel bag closed. I slung the strap over my shoulder and walked back out to the living room. Preston and Mackenzie stood side by side looking at me with pure disgust. They were waiting for me to apologize, to beg, to offer my meager savings to fix their catastrophic morning. Instead, I looked directly into his panicked eyes and let a calm, bright smile spread across my face. I told him he was the one who wanted me to budget. I explained I was simply following his expert financial advice by cutting out completely unnecessary expenses. I turned my back on them, opened the heavy oak door, and walked out of the penthouse without a backward glance, leaving him trapped in a financial prison of his own making. The heavy door clicked shut, severing my ties to his toxic delusion forever. As I stepped into the quiet hallway, the adrenaline surged through my veins. The illusion he had built was shattering, and I held the only hammer. I rode the elevator down to the lobby, greeting the concierge with a polite nod, as if my world had not just shifted entirely. Stepping outside, the crisp afternoon air felt remarkably clean. I pulled out my phone and sent a brief text message to Oliver. The message confirmed that the initial confrontation was complete and that Preston was thoroughly distracted by the immediate panic of the frozen accounts. I requested that Oliver proceed with the next phase of the asset lockdown. My phone vibrated almost instantly, with Oliver confirming the request. He assured me that Preston would be permanently barred from his own corporate servers before the day was over. I walked toward my humble car, feeling a profound sense of liberation. For years, I had deliberately minimized my existence to accommodate his fragile ego. I had worn cheap clothes and driven a loud, rattling car just to ensure he felt like the dominant provider. I had swallowed his constant insults and endured his daughter relentlessly disrespecting me to maintain absolute peace. I had barely reached the driver's side door of my old Civic when a heavy hand clamped down violently on my wrist. I spun around to find Preston breathless and wild-eyed. He had chased me down the service elevator. He was not going to let me walk away because he suddenly remembered he desperately needed the one thing I still possessed on paper, my pristine credit score. His accounts were frozen, and he needed liquid cash to cover the massive deposit for Mackenzie's car before the luxury dealership called the police for fraud. He tightened his grip on my arm, his voice dropping to a menacing, desperate whisper. He ordered me to get into his frozen Maserati because we were already late for our scheduled lunch with his parents at the country club. I knew exactly what he was planning. He wanted to ambush me in front of his wealthy, status-obsessed parents to bully me into co-signing a high-interest personal loan. I did not struggle. I simply pulled my wrist from his grasp, got into the passenger seat, and prepared for the next phase of his total destruction. The drive to the elite Oak Ridge Country Club was suffocatingly tense. Preston aggressively gripped the steering wheel, muttering harsh curses at the dashboard screen, which flashed a warning that his satellite radio subscription had just been suspended due to payment failure. I stared out the window, calculating my moves. When we arrived, the valets rushed forward to open our doors. Preston instantly plastered on his fake charming executive smile. He smoothed his designer jacket, completely masking the financial panic consuming him from the inside out. He grabbed my lower back, steering me forcefully through the grand mahogany doors into the exclusive dining room. His parents were already seated at a prime table overlooking the lush 18th hole. His mother wore a tennis skirt that cost more than my entire visible wardrobe, and his father sat swirling a glass of incredibly expensive bourbon. They looked me up and down with their usual thinly veiled disgust. His mother immediately commented on my plain beige sweater, asking loudly if I had forgotten we had a strict dress code at the club. She sighed dramatically, telling Preston he worked much too hard to be dragged down by a wife who refused to elevate her appearance to match his stature. His father chimed in, praising Preston for recently closing a supposed multi-million-dollar software deal, entirely ignorant to the fact that his son was currently completely penniless. Preston played the role of the exhausted, hardworking provider perfectly. He sat down, ordered a costly bottle of vintage wine, and immediately pulled a thick stack of loan documents from his leather briefcase. He slammed the papers onto the white linen tablecloth right in front of me. He pulled out a gold pen, commanding me to sign the guarantor line without reading it. He claimed his corporate funds were temporarily tied up in a massive offshore acquisition, and he needed $50,000 in bridge capital immediately to secure a vendor contract. His mother leaned across the table, her tone dripping with absolute venom. She told me to stop staring at the paper and sign it. She insisted it was the absolute least I could do after mooching off her brilliant son for 3 long years. She claimed I should finally make myself useful to a self-made man instead of just draining his resources. I looked down at the complex legal documents. The interest rate was predatory, bordering on outright extortion. I was trying to mortgage my financial identity to keep his sinking ship afloat for another 48 hours, until he could figure out why his company was locked down. I picked up the gold pen, but I did not sign. I looked him dead in the eye and stated I would never attach my name to his fraudulent debts. Preston slammed his fist on the table, causing the crystal glasses to rattle and spill wine onto the linen. His father raised his voice, demanding I show some basic respect to the man who put a luxury roof over my head. They were a pack of wolves entirely used to intimidating everyone around them into absolute submission. Before Preston could spit out another threat, a calm, deeply resonant voice cut through the thick tension. A tall, impeccably dressed African-American man stepped up to our table. It was DeAndre, my brilliant brother-in-law married to my sister Nicole. DeAndre was a senior forensic auditor at a top-tier international firm, a man whose mind worked like a flawless steel trap. He was at the country club dining with several high-profile corporate clients, but he had clearly noticed the escalating aggression at our table. DeAndre exuded absolute professional authority. He casually picked up the loan agreement Preston had shoved in my face. Preston immediately jumped up, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. I demanded to know what DeAndre thought he was doing, ordering him to drop the private financial documents immediately. DeAndre did not even blink. He adjusted his tailored suit cuffs, letting out a sharp, cold laugh as he scanned the contract with expert precision. He tossed the papers back onto the table with a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. DeAndre smoothly informed Preston that trying to secure a predatory loan using a spouse's credit score was pathetic enough, but hiding a massive federal tax lion in the fine print was borderline criminal. Preston's parents gasped, their eyes darting nervously between their son and the auditor. DeAndre pointed a long, steady finger at page 4 of the document. He loudly explained to the entire table that Preston was trying to trick me into assuming personal liability for a $200,000 penalty he owed the Internal Revenue Service for unpaid payroll taxes. Preston's facade completely shattered. He realized DeAndre had instantly decoded his desperate illegal maneuver. In his blind panic, Preston lashed out with the only weapon he had left. He hurled a racially charged elitist insult directly at DeAndre. He told my brother-in-law that a glorified calculator had no right to stand in the dining room of an exclusive club and interrupt a private billionaire family discussion. He told DeAndre to take his briefcase and get back to the servant quarters where he supposedly belonged. The blatant racism hung heavily in the quiet dining room. Several nearby tables went completely silent, the wealthy patrons turning to watch the confrontation. DeAndre did not raise his voice. He did not lose his temper or validate Preston's pathetic outburst with anger. Instead, DeAndre leaned forward, resting both hands firmly on the white tablecloth, trapping Preston in a gaze of absolute ice. DeAndre spoke with a chilling, calculated precision. He advised Preston to worry significantly less about his presence in the dining room and worry infinitely more about why the Securities and Exchange Commission was currently investigating his offshore wire transfers. The blood drained from Preston's face so fast he looked as though he might pass out right there on the patterned carpet. His arrogant father dropped his glass of bourbon, the amber liquid spilling across the table and dripping onto his expensive trousers. DeAndre casually straightened his posture, checking his luxury watch. He informed Preston that federal agents do not care about country club memberships when they are tracing embezzled corporate funds through fake shell companies. He promised Preston that the forensic audit he was about to face would rip his fake empire down to the very studs, exposing every single fraudulent vendor payment he had made over the past 3 years. Preston stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The terrifying realization that his financial crimes were no longer hidden paralyzed him entirely. I stood up from the table, smoothing my plain beige sweater. I looked down at my mother-in-law, who was staring at her son in absolute horror. I told her she was absolutely right about me needing to be useful. I explained that I was finally being useful to myself by walking away from a family of delusional broke frauds. I turned to DeAndre, thanking him for the timely financial advice. DeAndre offered me his arm with perfect gentlemanly grace. I took it, and together we walked away from the table. We walked through the grand dining room with our heads held high, projecting an aura of untouchable confidence. We left Preston hyperventilating in the center of the country club dining room, completely exposed in front of his wealthy parents and the surrounding elite members who were now whispering furiously among themselves. As we reached the heavy mahogany doors, DeAndre paused and looked down at me with a knowing smirk. He slipped a small folded piece of paper into my hand. I opened it as we stepped out into the crisp afternoon air. The handwritten note contained a single highly anticipated question. It asked if I was finally ready to pull the pin on the final grenade. I looked up at my brilliant brother-in-law, the man who had just systematically dismantled my husband's ego in under 3 minutes. I nodded, a genuine smile replacing the tight mask I had worn for years. The heavy silence we left behind in that dining room was the sweetest sound I had ever heard, but I knew the symphony of his destruction was only just beginning. I climbed into the sleek, bulletproof black Maybach that Oliver's private security team had delivered to the valet stand. DeAndre gave me a final nod before heading back to his clients. As the heavy doors of the luxury vehicle locked me safely inside, my phone buzzed with an alert from Oliver. Preston had just attempted to access the corporate payroll server and had been locked out by the biometric security protocol I had instituted earlier that morning. His panic was escalating into absolute hysteria. I settled into the plush leather seats, staring out the tinted windows as we pulled away from the country club. The war was officially underway, and Preston had brought a plastic knife to a nuclear fight. I watched his frozen Maserati shrink in the rearview mirror, savoring the knowledge that his next move would only tighten the noose I had meticulously crafted around his neck. The satisfaction of watching his manufactured reality crumble was profoundly beautiful. The ultimate financial reckoning was rapidly approaching, leaving him absolutely nowhere to hide. The quiet hum of the engine wrapped around me as we left the club. DeAndre sat across from me in the plush seats, opening his laptop. He did not waste time celebrating. His mind was dissecting the data dump Oliver extracted from Preston's servers. We directed the driver to a discreet coffee shop in the financial district. I needed a quiet place to review the exact magnitude of my husband's financial crimes before we moved to the next phase of his execution. We took a secluded corner table. DeAndre ordered 2 coffees and spread highly classified forensic accounting printouts across the marble table. He pointed a steady finger at a glaring anomaly buried deep within the operational expense reports. DeAndre explained that Preston had been funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars through a phantom vendor account labeled as digital consulting services. He tapped his pen against a sequence of recurring monthly transfers. The money was not paying for software development. It was being routed directly to a private real estate holding firm managing luxury properties in downtown Seattle. Before DeAndre could finish detailing the fraudulent paper trail, the heavy glass door of the cafe swung open with aggressive force. I looked up to see a young woman storming directly toward our table. She looked 24, wearing a designer trench coat, oversized sunglasses, and carrying a bright pink handbag. Her face was flushed with unhinged entitlement, and her heels clicked violently against the polished concrete floor. I recognized her instantly. It was Lexi Preston's so-called executive assistant. She actually spent her days accompanying him on extravagant trips and attending exclusive industry parties. She stopped right in front of our table, ripping off her sunglasses and glaring at me with pure, unfiltered rage. She slammed her perfectly manicured hands down on the marble surface, completely ignoring DeAndre's presence. Lexi leaned over the table, her voice shaking with arrogant fury. She demanded to know who I thought I was, accusing me of hacking Preston's accounts and ruining his life. She screamed that I needed to call the bank and give Preston his money back right this second. She complained that she had just tried to pay for her weekly spa treatment and her premium allowance card had bounced. Her voice grew louder, drawing the attention of several patrons seated nearby. She shrieked that the building manager of her luxury high-rise condo had just slapped an eviction notice on her front door because the corporate lease had been abruptly terminated that morning. Lexi blamed me for being a jealous, spiteful wife trying to punish Preston. She demanded I fix the glitch immediately. I did not yell back. I did not match her frantic energy. I simply took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the warm liquid soothe my throat. I looked at this foolish, desperate girl and felt absolutely nothing but cold clinical calculation. I set my cup down and picked up the forensic accounting printout DeAndre had just been showing me. I slid the thick stack of papers across the table, stopping it right under Lexi's trembling hands. I told her to lower her voice and look closely at the highlighted lines on the top page. I explained that she was not dealing with a jealous wife fighting over a shared checking account. I informed her that I was the absolute owner of the company, secretly funding her pathetic lifestyle. I watched her eyes dart down to the paper. The bold red ink clearly traced the embezzled funds from the corporate operational budget directly into the lease payments for her condo, her weekly allowance transfers, and her excessive luxury shopping habits. Lexi's arrogant sneer began to falter, replaced by a sudden confusion. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper. I explained that Preston did not earn the money he had been spending on her. He stole it from my holding company. I clarified that the allowance that bounced and the condo lease that was terminated were not personal gifts from a generous billionaire boyfriend. They were stolen corporate assets illegally funneled through a fake vendor account that she had personally signed for when she accepted the title of executive assistant. DeAndre seamlessly took over the conversation, his deep voice carrying the terrifying weight of a federal prosecutor. He informed Lexi that the Securities and Exchange Commission, along with federal authorities, were preparing a massive indictment for corporate embezzlement and wire fraud. He pointed out that because she was the direct recipient of those stolen funds and had signed the vendor agreements, she was a documented accessory to a multi-million-dollar federal crime. DeAndre stated that the authorities do not care about romantic entanglements. They care about paper trails, and her signature was all over the fraudulent documents used to drain the company. He warned her she was looking at a potential sentence of 10 to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. All the blood drained from Lexi's face. Her aggressive posture completely collapsed. She stumbled backward, her designer handbag slipping from her grasp and falling to the floor. The reality of her situation hit her like a runaway freight train. She was a highly expendable scapegoat in a massive corporate fraud scheme, and Preston had set her up to take the fall. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over her expensive makeup. Panic completely overtook her. She began shaking her head violently, her voice breaking as she frantically tried to distance herself from the man she had just been fiercely defending. She stammered that she did not know the money was stolen. She swore she thought Preston was just a generous tech founder, hiding their relationship from a toxic marriage. She pleaded with me, begging me to believe she never wanted to steal from my company. I watched her crumble, feeling a profound sense of clarity. The loyalty bought by stolen money vanishes the second the money disappears. I told Lexi ignorance is not a valid legal defense. I explained that if she wanted to avoid spending the best years of her life wearing a prison uniform, she needed to offer me something valuable enough to keep her name out of the federal indictment. I demanded the final piece of the puzzle that would seal Preston's fate permanently. Lexi did not hesitate for a single second. Self-preservation obliterated whatever twisted affection she held for my husband. She dropped to her knees, frantically unzipping her handbag. Her hands were shaking so severely she could barely grip the small objects inside. She pulled out a silver flash drive and slammed it onto the table next to the audit reports. Sobbing uncontrollably, she confessed everything. The drive contained Preston's private encrypted emails and offshore banking schedules. She revealed that Preston planned to completely drain the startup's remaining capital during the upcoming merger event. He was going to route the final massive payout through a labyrinth of international shell companies, abandon his daughter, divorce me, and flee to Dubai with Lexi by the end of the month. He had promised her a life of untouchable luxury in the Middle East. DeAndre swiftly picked up the flash drive, securing it inside his pocket. He looked down at the weeping girl with absolute disdain. He informed her that providing the evidence was a smart first step, but her future depended entirely on her continued cooperation with our legal team. He ordered her to pack her bags, move back with her parents, and wait for Oliver's office to arrange a formal witness immunity agreement. I stood up. I looked down at Lexi, curled into a miserable ball on the floor, crying hysterically over the ruin of her fantasy life. I felt no pity. She had willingly participated in the destruction of my marriage for designer bags and a luxury condo. I told her that she should consider herself extremely lucky that I preferred precise corporate justice over petty personal revenge. DeAndre and I walked out of the coffee shop, leaving Lexi sobbing on the concrete floor, entirely abandoned by the man she thought would give her the world. We climbed into the Maybach. DeAndre plugged the flash drive into his laptop. The encrypted files populated the screen with concrete proof of Preston's premeditated flight risk and total financial betrayal. The final nail in his coffin was handed to us by the very woman he planned to escape with. Preston thought he was a mastermind, but was just a desperate, predictable fraud. He had backed himself into a corner with no exits remaining. I leaned my head against the headrest, closing my eyes as the engine roared to life. We had the audit. We had the offshore escape plans. We had absolute control over his entire reality. The only thing left to do was let him walk blindly into the ultimate trap he had set for himself, and I was going to enjoy watching him burn. By the time DeAndre and I returned to Oliver's office, Preston was already spiraling into absolute financial desperation. Our intelligence indicated that he had spent the entire night frantically calling every venture capitalist and angel investor in his limited contact list. He was begging for a massive bridge loan. He desperately needed liquid cash to finalize the offshore transfers we had just discovered on his mistress's flash drive. Without a sudden influx of untraceable capital, his grand escape to Dubai would completely collapse. Preston did not know that his desperate search for a financial lifeline was being carefully monitored by my legal team. Oliver used his extensive network in the Seattle financial district to lay the perfect bait. Through a series of discreet proxy contacts, a top-tier private equity firm reached out to Preston. They offered him an emergency pitch meeting. They claimed they specialized in rescuing distressed tech startups from hostile corporate takeovers. Preston swallowed the hook without a single second of hesitation. He genuinely believed his legendary charisma could charm these phantom investors into handing over millions of dollars with zero due diligence. The meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock the following morning, at a sleek, imposing skyscraper in the heart of the city. Preston spent hours preparing his ultimate performance. He dragged Mackenzie out of bed, forcing her to accompany him to the pitch. He intended to use his teenage daughter as a human shield and a prop for sympathy. He planned to spin a pathetic sob story about a brilliant self-made tech founder being maliciously victimized by a crazy, jealous, and financially illiterate ex-wife. He wanted to paint me as a gold-digging monster who had somehow manipulated a legal loophole to freeze his hard-earned empire. He dressed in his most expensive tailored suit, the one purchased with my stolen funds, desperately trying to project an aura of unshakable success. Mackenzie wore a somber designer dress, pouting and complaining about being awake so early, completely oblivious to the fact that her father was walking them both straight to the slaughterhouse. They arrived at the private equity firm precisely on time. The receptionist, fully briefed on our operation, greeted Preston with calculated deference. She led him and a highly irritated Mackenzie down a long, quiet corridor lined with frosted glass walls and modern art. Preston walked with a fabricated swagger, adjusting his silk tie and whispering last-minute instructions to his daughter. He told her to look sad, to act like her future was unfairly hanging in the balance, and to let him do all the talking. He truly believed he was about to outsmart the entire financial world. The receptionist opened the heavy mahogany double doors to the grand boardroom and gestured for them to step inside. The room was vast and intimidating, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a dizzying view of the Seattle skyline. A massive polished table dominated the center of the space. At the far end of the table sat a high-backed leather swivel chair, turned completely away from the door, facing the panoramic view of the city. Preston confidently marched into the room, dropping his leather briefcase onto the table with a loud thud. He cleared his throat, adopting his deepest, most authoritative executive voice. He began his pitch, immediately addressing the back of the leather chair. He thanked the invisible senior partner for taking the meeting on such short notice. He launched into a highly rehearsed, passionate monologue about his groundbreaking software, claiming his vision was on the verge of changing the world. He smoothly transitioned into his sob story, his voice dripping with manufactured sorrow. He explained that a vindictive, unstable woman was currently attempting a hostile takeover of his life's work. He gestured dramatically to Mackenzie, claiming his innocent daughter was suffering because of this baseless vendetta. He asked for an emergency injection of $8 million, promising astronomical returns the second he crushed his crazy wife in family court. He finished his grand presentation with a confident, arrogant smile, waiting for the unseen investor to shower him with praise and a massive check. The room remained dead silent for 5 agonizing seconds. Then the heavy leather chair slowly spun around. I sat comfortably with my legs crossed, wearing a sharp, impeccably tailored charcoal suit. My hands were resting lightly on the armrests, and a cold, satisfied smile played across my face. Oliver sat to my immediate right, holding a thick legal binder, his expression entirely devoid of mercy. DeAndre sat to my left, his laptop open, already projecting the unarguable evidence of Preston's offshore fraud onto the massive screen behind me. Preston's arrogant smile vanished instantly. All the color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. He stumbled backward, his knees hitting the edge of a chair. He gasped, his eyes darting frantically between me, Oliver, and DeAndre. He could not comprehend what he was seeing. Mackenzie let out a loud, confused groan, asking her father why the pathetic archivist was sitting in the billionaire investor's chair. She demanded to know if this was some kind of sick joke. Preston could not answer her. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving as the horrifying reality of his situation began to crush him from the outside in. He looked at the walls, at the windows, and back at me, desperately searching for an escape route that did not exist. Oliver stood up slowly, the silence in the room amplifying the sharp sound of his expensive shoes on the hardwood floor. He picked up the heavy legal binder and tossed it directly across the mahogany table. It landed right in front of Preston with a definitive, echoing slam. Oliver looked at my husband with pure, unadulterated disgust. He spoke with a loud, booming authority that commanded the entire room. He introduced himself formally, stating he was the senior managing partner of the firm. Then he gestured toward me. He informed Preston that he had just spent the last 10 minutes pitching a fraudulent, failing tech company to the primary benefactor and absolute owner of this private equity firm. Oliver stated clearly that Stella owned the building, the firm, the capital, and the very air Preston was currently struggling to breathe. Preston began sweating profusely. Large drops of perspiration formed on his forehead and rolled down his pale cheeks. His perfectly tailored suit suddenly looked like a cheap costume. He stammered, his voice cracking and weak. He tried to claim this was illegal, that I could not possibly be the angel investor, that I was just a plain woman who bought discount groceries. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the cool wood of the table. I stared directly into his panicked wide eyes. I told him he should have paid much closer attention to the woman he was verbally abusing every single day. I explained that the $12 million that built his entire fake billionaire persona came directly from my private trust. I revealed that I had quietly funded his dreams because I once believed in him, but he used my money to fund a secret mistress, buy unnecessary luxury cars, and attempt to abandon me. I pointed to the massive screen behind me, where DeAndre had displayed the offshore flight itinerary and the exact bank routing numbers Lexi had provided. I told Preston that his grand escape to Dubai was officially cancelled. I explained that requesting an $8 million bridge loan to cover up his corporate embezzlement was a bold move, but asking the person he stole from to fund his getaway was a level of stupidity I had never witnessed before. Mackenzie finally understood the gravity of the situation. She looked at the screen, then at her father, her arrogant demeanor completely shattering. She realized the money was truly gone, and the woman she had mercilessly bullied held the keys to her entire existence. Preston dropped into the chair behind him, utterly defeated, grasping his chest as his manufactured empire burned to the ground right in front of his eyes. He begged me to listen to reason. He pleaded that we were a team, that we were married, and that we could fix this small misunderstanding without involving federal authorities. He tried to reach across the table, his hands trembling violently, claiming that the offshore accounts were just a tax strategy he was building for our future. He swore he never intended to leave me, insisting the mistress was just a meaningless distraction, a momentary lapse in judgment brought on by the intense stress of running a massive tech empire. He told me he loved me, his voice pitching into a pathetic whining frequency that made my skin crawl. He begged me not to take away his company, his reputation, and his life's work. I did not flinch. I did not show a single ounce of mercy. I looked at the sweating, desperate man who had laughed at me over a gallon of milk just 48 hours ago. I calmly informed him that his life's work was nothing but a mirage funded by my capital. I told him he was not a visionary tech founder, but simply a poorly disguised thief who got incredibly sloppy. I turned to Mackenzie, who was now weeping openly, realizing her luxurious future had evaporated into thin air. I told her that she would no longer need to worry about asking permission to spend my money, because her access to my wealth was permanently and irrevocably terminated. DeAndre closed his laptop with a sharp snap. He informed Preston that the private equity firm would obviously be declining his absurd pitch for an $8 million bridge loan. He advised Preston to gather his fake financial projections and walk out of the building before security escorted him to the pavement. Preston remained frozen in his chair, paralyzed by the absolute totality of his defeat. He looked down at his shaking hands, the reality of his impending criminal charges and public humiliation finally sinking deep into his bones. I stood up, buttoned my charcoal suit jacket, and looked down at my husband with supreme indifference. I told him the meeting was over and he was dismissed. Preston did not move immediately. He remained bolted to the expensive leather chair, staring at the closed mahogany door long after I had exited the boardroom. The profound silence of the private equity firm pressed down on him, amplifying the crushing reality of his total defeat. He had walked into this building expecting to charm his way into an $8 million lifeline. Instead, he had handed the final pieces of his fraudulent puzzle directly to the executioner. When he finally stood, his legs trembled. He grabbed his leather briefcase and stumbled out into the hallway. Mackenzie followed close behind him, her usual arrogant stride replaced by a frantic shuffle. The receptionist offered a polite smile as they passed the front desk. The heavy glass doors sealed shut behind them, locking them out of the sanctuary of wealth. The crisp Seattle wind hit him on the pavement, igniting a terrifying fury. He marched toward his useless frozen Maserati, barking orders at his daughter to get inside. His mind immediately began spinning a new narrative. If he could not secure the capital to fund his escape to Dubai, he would scorch the earth before I could enjoy my victory. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket. His carefully curated public image was the only asset he had left. He had spent years cultivating a massive following of tech entrepreneurs on social media. They worshipped his unapologetic arrogance and his supposed financial genius. Preston decided he would weaponize that audience. He would launch a preemptive strike, painting himself as the tragic victim of a malicious sabotage. He climbed into the driver's seat. He instructed Mackenzie to open her Instagram account now. They were going to broadcast their manufactured misery globally. Preston hit the live button. Within seconds, thousands of his loyal followers joined the stream. He stared directly into the camera, playing the role of a desperate visionary. He began his performance with a heavy sigh. He told his audience that his life work was currently under attack by the person he trusted most. He branded me an abusive gold-digging psychopath. He spun a highly detailed story about how I had spent the last 3 years secretly siphoning funds from his accounts and orchestrating a hostile corporate takeover out of pure jealousy. He claimed I was a bitter archivist who could not stand watching him succeed. To add tragic authenticity, he panned the camera to Mackenzie. She sat in the passenger seat weeping on command, telling her followers that her cruel stepmother had canceled her bank cards. The smear campaign worked with terrifying speed. The tech community, always eager for dramatic corporate gossip, swallowed the narrative without a single question. Preston fed them exactly what they wanted to hear. He used industry buzzwords claiming I was a malicious activist investor trying to gut a profitable startup for personal gain. He begged his network to share the stream to expose the truth and to stand with him against this supposed corporate terrorism. My phone began buzzing relentlessly in my pocket as I rode in the back of the Maybach with DeAndre and Oliver. Notifications flooded my screen. Strangers were finding my private profiles, flooding my inbox with venomous, highly aggressive messages. Preston and his loyal tech bro disciples called me a corporate parasite, a leech and a bitter housewife, ruining a truly great and legendary legacy. They threatened to expose my home address. They threatened to ruin my professional reputation. They bought into his delusion, completely weaponizing their collective outrage to defend a man who was actively planning to steal their investment capital and flee away to the Middle East. I watched the live stream from the comfort of the armored vehicle, my expression entirely neutral. Preston was mid-rant, sweating profusely, shouting into the camera about how he would fight me in every court in the country. He was rallying his troops, demanding that his fellow founders boycott any institution associated with my name. He was arrogant, aggressive, and completely blind to the reality of his situation. I turned my phone screen toward DeAndre, raising a single eyebrow. DeAndre let out a deep, resonant chuckle, shaking his head at the sheer audacity of my husband and his performance. He opened his laptop, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he accessed the master administrative portal for the Vanguard Holdings corporate infrastructure. We did not need to issue a public statement to counter his ridiculous lies. We did not need to engage in a petty social media war with a gang of delusional tech bros. We simply needed to remind Preston exactly who owned the platform he was currently standing right on. I looked at DeAndre and instructed him to review the corporate expense accounts regarding executive telecommunications. DeAndre clicked through the digital ledgers, confirming what I already knew. Every single device Preston and Mackenzie owned, from their premium smartphones to their unlimited international data plans, was registered under the primary corporate account. The startup paid for the phones, the service, and the mobile hotspots. Because my trust had officially liquidated the corporate holding company and assumed absolute control of all assets, those devices were legally my property. I leaned back against the plush leather seat, a cold, calculating satisfaction washing over me. I told DeAndre that Preston was currently using corporate property to engage in a public smear campaign against the majority shareholder. I stated clearly that this constituted a direct and egregious breach of corporate compliance. I ordered DeAndre to terminate the accounts immediately. I simply did not want a temporary suspension. I really wanted a permanent, irreversible shutdown of all devices registered directly to Preston and his spoiled daughter. DeAndre smiled, a sharp professional grin that signaled absolute destruction. He navigated to the administrative control panel for the telecommunications provider. He selected the primary executive group, highlighting Preston and his phone number, Mackenzie and her phone number, and the mobile router installed in the Maserati. He typed a brief authorization code, citing emergency corporate compliance protocols, and moved his cursor over the termination command. On my phone screen, Preston was reaching the crescendo of his dramatic broadcast. He was raising his fist, shouting that the truth would always prevail, and promising his viewers that he would never surrender his company to a gold-digging fraud. He promised a massive update later that evening, telling his followers to stay tuned for the ultimate exposure of my supposed crimes. DeAndre pressed the enter key. The execution was instantaneous. The live stream on my screen froze abruptly. Preston froze and his face was stuck in an ugly mid-shout grimace. A small loading circle spun briefly in the center of the video before the application displayed a harsh, undeniable error message indicating the broadcast had ended unexpectedly. Back in the Maserati, the reality of the shutdown hit Preston like a physical blow. His phone screen went black. The cellular signal indicator in the corner of his display dropped to 0. He frantically tapped the glass, swiping desperately to refresh the application, but the device was completely dead. It was no longer a premium piece of technology, connecting him to thousands of adoring fans. It was an expensive, useless brick of glass and metal. He shouted at Mackenzie, demanding she use her phone to reconnect the stream. Mackenzie stared at her own device in absolute horror, whining that her screen was also locked and her service had completely vanished. Preston furiously jabbed at the dashboard interface of the luxury car, trying to activate the vehicle and its built-in wireless network. The screen flashed a bright red error code, stating the account had been permanently suspended by the corporate administrator. The profound silence of the dead digital space swallowed them whole. His grand, triumphant public crusade was silenced mid-sentence, in the absolutely most humiliating and abrupt way imaginable. He was cut off from his audience, isolated from his supporters, and entirely stripped of his voice. He had tried to play the powerful, aggrieved billionaire, but he could not even afford the data required to broadcast his own lies. The terrifying truth of his absolute powerlessness crashed down on him. He currently owned nothing. He controlled nothing. He was sitting in a frozen car holding a deactivated phone, completely at the mercy of the woman he had spent over 3 years trying to destroy. I locked my phone and slipped it back into my pocket, feeling the quiet hum of the Maybach engine as we cruised the streets. The smear campaign was over before it could even generate a meaningful spark. His tech bro friends were left staring at a blank screen, their outrage abruptly extinguished by technical difficulties. They would move on to the next distraction within minutes, entirely forgetting the desperate man who had begged for their loyalty. Preston was completely neutralized. I was trapped in a digital void, suffocating under the weight of his own hubris. The day was progressing perfectly. The absolute digital silence from my extremely panicked husband Preston lasted exactly 14 hours before he made his most catastrophic mistake yet. Early the next morning, Oliver summoned me back to the Vanguard Holdings Tower. The atmosphere in the corner office was thick with intense legal anticipation. DeAndre paced in front of the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, his arms crossed tightly over his tailored suit. Preston had gone absolutely nuclear within the local family court system. He filed an emergency injunction demanding an immediate unfreezing of all personal and corporate assets. To back his absurd demand, his cheap lawyer submitted a shocking piece of new evidence. Oliver slid a thick manila folder across the polished mahogany desk toward my waiting hands. I opened it and stared at a highly official-looking document bearing my forged signature. The document claimed I willingly agreed to surrender 50% of my entire private equity trust to Preston in the event of a divorce or a corporate separation. Preston was claiming he was legally entitled to half of the entire Vanguard Holdings empire. He constructed a completely fabricated narrative portraying himself as a silent co-founder of my family trust. He argued that his supposed sweat equity over the past 3 years legally entitled him to billions of dollars. I read the absolute fiction, feeling a cold wave of disgust mixed with intense fascination. He was truly a cornered rat, lashing out with the most reckless weapon he could find. The sheer audacity of his latest maneuver was staggering and almost completely detached from reality. Preston actually believed he could swindle a federal court the same way he swindled his gullible venture capital friends. Mackenzie was proudly listed as a primary witness to the fraudulent document signing event. Her signature added another layer of desperate perjury to his wildly fabricated and illegal tale. They were trying to steal the very foundation of my grandfather's legacy through a crude, easily disproven forgery. I looked up at DeAndre, who wore a predatory gleam in his dark, intelligent eyes. The brilliant forensic auditor tapped the bottom of the second page with his silver pen. He pointed directly at the official notary stamp pressing firmly against the heavy parchment paper. He instructed me to look very closely at the date printed in dark blue ink. The date stamped next to the fraudulent signature was October 14th of the previous year. DeAndre pulled up a highly secure digital calendar on his sleek corporate tablet computer screen. He cross-referenced that specific date with my verified flight logs and corporate travel records. A slow, deeply satisfied smile spread across my face as I realized his brilliant discovery. On October 14th of the previous year, I was definitely not residing in Seattle, Washington. I was not even located anywhere within the borders of the continental United States. I was in Tokyo, Japan, actively overseeing a highly complex acquisition for my private trust. My international passport was heavily stamped by highly official and strict Japanese customs border agents. My commercial flight records were permanently documented by reliable international aviation authorities and security databases. I spent that entire week attending high-security corporate board meetings, surrounded by reliable witnesses. Dozens of highly respected international executives could easily testify to my exact physical geographical location. It was completely physically and logically impossible for me to have signed that amendment document. DeAndre explained that Preston chose that specific October date because he thought I was vulnerable. My arrogant husband genuinely believed I was simply away on a quiet, mundane, personal retreat. He had paid absolutely zero attention to my actual schedule or my true professional movements. He foolishly failed to realize that my supposed boring archivist trip was a major deployment. My week away was a highly documented, incredibly secure international corporate wealth management deployment mission. The desperate forgery was not just incredibly sloppy, it was absolutely and easily provably impossible. I immediately reached into my pocket to grab my smartphone and call the local authorities. I wanted to report the massive fraud and crush his pathetic existence right then and there. I wanted to march directly into the downtown courthouse and expose his pathetic, desperate lie. I wanted the presiding judge to see the absolute truth about my completely fraudulent husband. But Oliver raised a single hand, his heavy gold rings catching the bright morning light. The veteran attorney wore a chilling, deeply calculating expression that demanded my complete and immediate attention. Oliver calmly advised patience, lowering his hand and leaning forward over his polished mahogany desk. He rested his elbows firmly on the desk and laid out a far more devastating strategy. He explained that if we rejected the document right now in family court, nothing major happens. Preston would only face minor civil penalties for submitting a questionable and slightly inaccurate contract. He might receive a tiny slap on the wrist from a frustrated and overworked local judge. Oliver wanted something much more permanent and utterly destructive for a man who steals billions. The ruthless lawyer suggested we step back quietly and set the ultimate inescapable legal snare. He explained that Preston was scheduled to appear before a federal bankruptcy and asset judge. This highly anticipated federal court hearing was scheduled to take place early the following morning. Preston planned to officially enter this fake document into the permanent binding federal legal record. If I waited just 24 hours, he would swear under a strict federal oath. If he swore that the document was authentic, the entire legal game would change instantly. Submitting the forged pre-nuptial amendment to a sitting federal judge was a terrible idea. Under penalty of perjury, Preston would instantly upgrade his massive crime to a severe felony. He would escalate from a minor civil dispute to a massive federal fraud perjury charge. He would voluntarily hand the vicious federal prosecutors a neatly packaged, entirely undeniable felony case. This specific type of financial felony carried a severe and absolutely mandatory minimum prison sentence. Oliver's brilliant plan was completely ruthless, legally flawless, and terrifyingly precise in its calculated execution. DeAndre nodded his head in absolute agreement, his forensic auditor mind appreciating the deadly trap. DeAndre stated that the federal judge would eventually review my international flight logs and stamps. The judge would immediately alert the federal authorities regarding the blatantly obvious and terrible forgery. The Securities and Exchange Commission would immediately fast-track their existing ongoing corporate embezzlement investigation. Preston would quickly discover that he was not just going to lose his fake startup. He was not just going to lose his luxury cars, his penthouse, and his dignity. He was going to completely and irrevocably lose his personal freedom and his entire future. He would walk directly into a brutal federal penitentiary of his own arrogant free will. Mackenzie would also face severe legal consequences for willingly providing a fraudulent witness signature today. She would learn a very harsh and permanent lesson about participating in massive federal crimes. I looked between the two brilliant men sitting with me in the corner office. The veteran legal shark and the brilliant forensic auditor had built the perfect financial guillotine. They had meticulously constructed a trap that would sever Preston from society for many years. I slowly closed the thick manila folder and slid it firmly back to Oliver's desk. I looked directly into Oliver's calculating eyes and told him that I agreed to wait. I completely agreed to use the fraudulent document as bait to destroy my husband forever. I would happily let my arrogant husband walk proudly into federal court tomorrow morning early. I would let him stand before the judge and confidently swear his miserable life away. He would raise his right hand and promise to tell the absolute truth to everyone. Then he would present a document that would instantly lock him in a federal cage. The trap was officially set, the snare was waiting, and his total destruction was guaranteed. We spent the next 2 hours drinking expensive coffee and preparing our final undeniable evidence. DeAndre printed high-resolution copies of my stamped passport pages and all international flight manifests. Oliver drafted a beautiful, devastating legal brief that would expose the lie immediately after submission. We were going to let him dig his own grave, jump inside, and bury himself. My phone remained blissfully quiet. Preston's lines still completely dead from the corporate telecommunications shutdown. He was entirely isolated from the world, relying solely on his own massive destructive hubris. He was desperately preparing to outsmart the very legal system that would soon swallow him. I stood up and walked to the towering windows looking down at the city. Tomorrow, the fake billionaire would become exactly what he had always truly been underneath. He would become a documented, incarcerated, utterly ruined criminal with absolutely no money or power. The reality check was arriving, and I could hardly wait to watch him fall apart. The morning sun pierced the towering glass windows of Vanguard Holdings, casting sharp shadows across Oliver's corner office. While Preston paced whatever cheap hotel he had secured preparing his fraudulent federal court submission, my team finalized the corporate kill shot. DeAndre had spent the entire night running a comprehensive forensic accounting sweep through the captured startup servers. He sat at the mahogany table, eyes fixed intently on his dual monitors. The sheer volume of financial irregularities he had uncovered was staggering even to a seasoned auditor. Preston had not just skimmed off the top. He had systematically gutted the entire operational budget of the company I secretly funded. DeAndre tapped a final keystroke, and the printer in the corner hummed to life, spitting out hundreds of pages of undeniable, heavily documented evidence. He looked up, removed his reading glasses, and gave me a grim professional nod. The sweep was officially complete. Every single stolen dollar was tracked, categorized, and tied directly to Preston's personal authorization codes. DeAndre had successfully mapped a complex labyrinth of wire transfers that funneled over $8 million out of the primary corporate accounts. The money had been routed through a sophisticated network of fake offshore shell companies designed to look like legitimate software vendors. Instead, those funds paid for his mistress Lexi's luxury condo, her extravagant allowance, and the endless stream of designer shopping sprees for his spoiled daughter Mackenzie. I poured myself a cup of black coffee, feeling a surge of icy anticipation. We had the weapon and it was time to deploy it. I authorized DeAndre to act as the proxy for Vanguard Holdings, utilizing our 85% majority shareholder status to force an immediate emergency meeting of Preston's remaining board of directors. The notices dispatched electronically, flashing onto the screens of every key investor and executive associated with the startup. Because the company was under a severe financial freeze, the board members arrived at the downtown Vanguard Tower with terrifying speed. They were desperate, confused, and demanding immediate answers regarding their frozen equity. They filed into the grand executive boardroom, taking their seats around the massive oval table. These were the same men who had chuckled just days ago when Preston humiliated me over a gallon of milk. Today they looked incredibly small. Their usual arrogant swagger was completely replaced by a heavy, suffocating anxiety. I remained in the adjacent observation room watching the proceedings through a tinted glass panel. This specific battle belonged to DeAndre. He strode into the boardroom carrying a thick leather binder exuding an aura of absolute uncompromising professional authority. He did not introduce himself with pleasantries. He walked directly to the head of the table, connected his secure laptop to the primary display system, and plunged the room into a chilling silence. Preston was noticeably absent, barred from the premises by private security until the board reached its final verdict. DeAndre commanded the room instantly. He pressed a button and the massive screen behind him illuminated with a complex color-coded financial schematic. He introduced himself as the senior forensic auditor appointed by the majority shareholder. He calmly informed the panicked executives their chief executive officer was treating the corporate treasury like a personal piggy bank. A murmur of outrage rippled through the seated men, but DeAndre cut it off with a raised hand. He projected the first ledger onto the screen. He highlighted a recurring monthly expenditure categorized under international server maintenance. With surgical precision, DeAndre proved that these massive wire transfers never went to a server farm. They went directly to a high-end real estate management firm in downtown Seattle, paying the exorbitant lease on a luxury condo occupied by a 24-year-old woman named Lexi. The board members gasped as DeAndre displayed the lease agreements, all bearing Preston's forged corporate authorizations. DeAndre did not stop there. He advanced the slide exposing fake consulting fees paid to a shell corporation registered in Dubai. He linked the shell corporation to Preston's personal offshore accounts, demonstrating a clear, premeditated plan to siphon capital and flee the country. Finally, DeAndre brought up the corporate expense accounts. He meticulously detailed how Mackenzie's luxury shopping sprees, lavish vacations, and expensive spa treatments were illegally coded as corporate promotional expenses. The grand total of Preston's blatant embezzlement stood at exactly $8 million. The executives were visibly horrified, their faces pale as they realized their brilliant founder was nothing but a common, remarkably sloppy thief who had completely destroyed their investments. The heavy tension in the boardroom was suddenly shattered by shouting in the outer hallway. The heavy mahogany doors flew open with a violent crash. Mackenzie stormed into the room, pushing past a startled security guard. She was completely oblivious to the gravity of the corporate execution taking place. She wore an entitled scowl, clutching her deactivated designer smartphone like a weapon. She had somehow bypassed the lobby restrictions, likely using an old executive access pass. Mackenzie marched straight toward the massive oval table, ignoring the horrified stares of the board members. She slammed her hands down on the polished wood, throwing a massive tantrum in the middle of a high-stakes corporate audit. She screamed that her premium credit cards were still bouncing and demanded to know where her father was hiding. Her voice was shrill, echoing painfully against the glass walls. She complained she was trying to register for fall college courses, but the university bursar had just rejected her payment profile. She shrieked that she needed her massive tuition fund unlocked immediately because her wealthy friends were already securing their luxury campus housing. She looked wildly around the room, demanding one of the executives write a check to fix this ridiculous glitch. The sheer audacity of her demanding stolen money in a room full of the men her father had just robbed was staggering. The board members stared at her in utter disbelief, too shocked to formulate a response to her unhinged outburst. DeAndre remained perfectly still, watching her childish display with cold, glacial eyes. He did not raise his voice or show a single ounce of intimidation. He calmly reached into his leather binder and extracted a single highlighted piece of paper. He walked around the large table and stopped right in front of the furious teenager. He held the document out to her. Mackenzie snatched it from his hand, her eyes darting over the numbers with a confused, angry scowl. DeAndre smoothly informed her she was looking at the exact routing history of her highly anticipated college tuition fund. He explained, his deep voice carrying to every corner of the boardroom, that her father had liquidated that specific educational account 3 weeks ago. Mackenzie froze, the color rapidly draining from her cheeks. DeAndre pointed a long, steady finger at the final destination of the massive wire transfer. He told her in a tone devoid of pity that her precious tuition money was gone forever. Her father had not invested it or saved it for her future. He had used every single dime of her college fund to purchase a luxury private yacht currently docked in Miami, registering the vessel under a fake corporate entity to hide it from federal investigation. The devastating truth hit Mackenzie like a physical blow. The prestigious university education she felt entitled to had been stolen by the very man who taught her to treat everyone else like garbage. Before Mackenzie could fully process the absolute destruction of her future, the boardroom doors opened. Preston was shoved into the room by 2 large security guards. He had been caught trying to sneak into the building through the loading dock. He looked sweaty and frantic. He saw the financial schematics projected on the massive screen. He saw DeAndre standing tall and authoritative. He saw the board members glaring at him with pure murderous hatred. And then he saw his daughter holding the printed ledger. Mackenzie did not hesitate. The blind loyalty she had always shown her father evaporated instantly, replaced by vicious, self-serving rage. She lunged forward, waving the printed ledger in his terrified face. She screamed at him with a ferocity that made the seasoned executives flinch. She called him a pathetic liar, thief, and a monster. She shrieked that he ruined her entire life to buy a stupid boat in Florida. She demanded he fix it, hitting his chest as she sobbed hysterically. Preston tried to shush her, tried grabbing her arms, and begged the board to listen to his explanation. He babbled that it was a strategic tax maneuver. His desperate lies fell on deaf, unforgiving ears. The senior board member stood and slammed his fist on the table. He formally called for an immediate binding vote. The executive motion was swift, merciless, and legally binding. The board unanimously voted to remove Preston from his position as chief executive officer, stripping him of all corporate privileges and abandoning him to the federal authorities. A narcissist stripped of his power does not experience clarity. He experiences profound, unyielding delusion. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the Seattle financial district, Preston found himself wandering the streets without a company, without a fortune, and without a single ally. His daughter Mackenzie had abandoned him, screaming that he was a total fraud. Lexi had already blocked his number. Yet Preston convinced himself this was merely a temporary setback. His twisted mind reframed the massive federal embezzlement expose as a minor misunderstanding that could easily be smoothed over with the right influx of unregulated capital. He remembered the prestigious Silicon Valley Horizons charity gala was taking place that very evening at the Grand Ballroom of the Olympic Hotel. It was an exclusive, highly restricted event, heavily attended by angel investors, international venture capitalists, and the tech elite. In his mind, he just needed one incredibly wealthy investor who hated corporate red tape as much as he did. There was only one problem. His accounts were completely frozen, and his bespoke designer suits were locked inside the waterfront penthouse he was legally barred from entering. Driven by sheer desperation, Preston walked into a discount formal wear shop on the edge of the city. He used a prepaid emergency cash card he kept hidden in his gym bag to rent a standard, poorly fitted black tuxedo. The cheap polyester fabric scratched against his neck, a far cry from the imported Italian silk he was accustomed to wearing, but he ignored the discomfort. He spent 30 minutes in the cramped dressing room, practicing his confident billionaire smile in the smudged mirror. He practiced a fabricated pitch about an offshore artificial intelligence project, entirely ignoring the fact that federal investigators were already assembling his arrest warrant. By 8 precisely that evening, Preston arrived at the grand entrance of the Olympic Hotel. He bypassed the valet line, having walked 6 blocks in the freezing rain to save the remaining balance on his prepaid card. He slipped past the distracted event coordinators at the front desk, utilizing a borrowed VIP lanyard he had kept from a previous charity event. The grand ballroom was a spectacular display of wealth and influence. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over hundreds of tech billionaires, philanthropists, and industry titans. Waiters in crisp white uniforms circulated with trays of premium champagne and tiny delicate luxury caviar appetizers. For a brief fleeting moment, Preston felt like he was back where he belonged. He grabbed a glass of champagne, straightened his cheap bow tie, and immediately began hunting for targets. He spotted Richard Vance, a notorious venture capitalist known for taking massive risks. Preston approached him with false bravado, offering a firm handshake and launching straight into a pitch about a revolutionary stealth startup requiring immediate, untraceable bridge funding. Vance looked at Preston with a mixture of pity and outright disgust. News in the financial sector traveled faster than light. Vance smoothly pulled his hand away, wiped it on a cocktail napkin, and informed Preston that nobody was going to give a single dime to a man who embezzled his own daughter's college fund to buy a yacht for his mistress. The rejection was brutal, public, and loud enough for surrounding guests to hear. People began to turn away as Preston approached. The elite crowd parted around him like a toxic spill. Whispers followed him through the ballroom, mocking his rented tuxedo and his spectacular, highly publicized downfall. Preston was sweating profusely, the cheap polyester of his jacket trapping the heat of his rising panic. He retreated to a dark corner near the service doors, frantically scanning the room for anyone who might not have heard the news of his board removal. The humiliation was becoming physically unbearable, but his enormous ego refused to let him leave. He convinced himself that the night was not over, that the true heavy hitters had not yet arrived. Suddenly, the soft classical music playing through the ballroom speakers faded into silence. The bright ambient lights dimmed, leaving only dramatic spotlights illuminating the grand marble staircase at the center of the room. A hush fell over the sophisticated crowd. The master of ceremonies stepped up to the crystal podium on the main stage. He tapped the microphone, his deep voice echoing across the vast space. He welcomed the distinguished guests and announced that the evening had already broken all previous fundraising records. He explained that this unprecedented success was entirely due to the remarkable generosity of a single visionary benefactor. The announcer praised this anonymous donor for single-handedly financing 3 new pediatric research wings at the local children's hospital, describing her as a titan of industry who preferred to let her charitable actions speak louder than her public profile. He declared that tonight, for the very first time, the guest of honor had graciously agreed to step out of the shadows and formally accept the Foundation's highest humanitarian award. Preston watched from the shadows, his mind spinning with jealous resentment. He desperately wished he was the billionaire about to be showered with endless adoration. The heavy velvet curtains at the top of the grand marble staircase slowly pulled back. The spotlight tracked precisely to the center of the landing. I stepped forward, pausing for a moment to look out over the sea of upturned faces. I was not wearing my usual plain beige sweater or my comfortable worn-out jeans. I wore a breathtaking custom-tailored emerald green silk gown that draped flawlessly against me. The fabric caught the bright light, shimmering like dark water. A delicate diamond necklace, a treasured heirloom from my late grandfather, rested against my collarbone. My hair was styled in sleek, elegant waves, and my posture radiated absolute, untouchable power. The entire ballroom erupted into deafening applause. Industry titans and legendary investors clapped enthusiastically, their faces filled with genuine awe and deep respect. I began my descent down the grand staircase, moving with slow, deliberate grace. Every eye in the room was fixed firmly upon me. Oliver stood at the bottom of the stairs alongside DeAndre, both men wearing impeccable designer tuxedos, clapping proudly for the woman they had helped step fully into her own power. As I reached the final marble step, the crowd parted respectfully, creating a wide, clear path toward the main stage. I walked through the center of the ballroom, acknowledging the respectful nods of the city's most powerful figures. And then I saw him. Preston was standing near the service doors, completely frozen in place. His jaw was slack and his eyes were wide with a terrifying comprehension. The woman he had relentlessly mocked for buying discount groceries was the guest of honor, the primary donor, and the ultimate master of this entire high society universe. The sheer impossibility of the situation completely shattered what remained of Preston's fragile sanity. The cognitive dissonance between the subservient wife he thought he controlled and the powerful billionaire commanding the room was too massive for his narcissistic brain to process. He broke away from the wall, his face twisting into an ugly mask of pure rage. He lunged forward, pushing violently past a group of startled investors. I ignored the gasps of the wealthy guests as he charged directly into the center of the cleared path. Before DeAndre or Oliver could intercept, Preston closed the distance between us. He reached out and aggressively grabbed my left wrist, his fingers digging painfully into my skin. He pulled me roughly toward him, his breath reeking of cheap champagne and desperate panic. He snarled my name, demanding to know what sick game I was playing and how I had manipulated my way into this exclusive charity event. He accused me of wearing a stolen dress and ordered me to leave before I embarrassed him further. The entire ballroom went dead silent. The music stopped completely. I did not scream. I did not try to pull my arm away. I simply looked down at his shaking, sweaty hand gripping my wrist and then raised my eyes to meet his terrified gaze. My expression was pure, unadulterated ice. Within 3 seconds, 4 massive private security guards in dark suits swarmed him. They grabbed his shoulders, twisted his arms forcefully behind his back, and effortlessly broke his hold on me. Preston struggled wildly, shouting that he was a respected tech founder and that I was his wife. I smoothed the silk fabric of my emerald gown, stepping slightly closer to him, as the guards held him completely immobilized. I looked directly into his panicked, bloodshot eyes, answering my voice carried clearly across the silent, captivated room. I told him I had explicitly warned him to watch his budget. I smiled a cold, piercingly sharp smile, leaning in just a fraction of an inch. I reminded him that he could not afford the $9.18 milk at the grocery store, and he certainly could not afford to be standing in this room. The grip the security guards held on, Preston tightened as my words echoed in the silent ballroom. His face shifted from pale terror to bright, feverish red. He opened his mouth to scream another insult, trying to reclaim his shattered dignity in front of the Seattle tech elite. He jerked his shoulders violently against the massive men holding him, demanding they unhand a billionaire. He believed he could still shout his way out of the abyss. But before a single sound escaped his throat, the grand mahogany doors swung open with a resounding crash. A team of 6 men and women in dark windbreakers marched into the room. FBI agents, flanked by agents from the Securities and Exchange Commission, moved with absolute precision. The master of ceremonies stepped away from his podium. The crowd of wealthy investors parted instantly, creating a wide path for the federal authorities. DeAndre stepped forward from the staircase, a satisfied gleam in his eye, and handed a sealed folder to the lead agent. The folder contained the culmination of the forensic audit and proof of forged court documents. The lead agent, a tall man with an uncompromising gaze, walked directly up to my struggling husband. He did not introduce himself. He pulled heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. He announced Preston's full legal name, his voice booming across the space. He declared that Preston was under immediate arrest for corporate embezzlement, international wire fraud, and his newest crime, federal perjury and forgery. Preston stopped struggling. His body went limp, held upright only by the firm grasp of my security detail. They spun Preston around roughly. The cheap rented tuxedo jacket ripped slightly at the shoulder seam as the agent wrenched his arms backward. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs locking around his wrists resonated through the silent ballroom. The agent began reciting the Miranda rights with a cold, practiced rhythm. He informed Preston he had the right to remain silent, a right he should have exercised years ago. Preston looked over his shoulder, his eyes wide and vacant, staring at me as if I were a ghost. He was sweating profusely, the cheap fabric of his collar stained and clinging to his neck. He was stripped of his cars, his penthouse, his company, and his freedom. The Seattle elite, the people Preston desperately wanted to impress to secure his offshore bridge loan, pulled out their smartphones. They began recording the spectacular downfall of the man who had called me a leech. He was a disgraced, handcuffed criminal being frog-marched out of a charity gala in a rented suit. The agents escorted him firmly down the center aisle. He stumbled over his own feet, his head hanging in absolute shame. As the ballroom doors closed behind the federal procession sealing his fate, Oliver stepped up to my side. He held an encrypted tablet. He adjusted his glasses and smiled, tapping the glass screen. He informed me the authorities had successfully apprehended the primary target, but the tactical operation was only half complete. He handed me the tablet. The screen displayed a high-definition live feed from the security cameras installed inside the waterfront penthouse. The emergency shareholder audit had transferred all property oversight to Apex Property Management, granting me absolute access to the internal surveillance network. I looked down at the glowing screen, watching the final act of my strategic execution unfold in real time. It was 10:30 at night. Inside the sprawling luxury penthouse, Mackenzie was entirely oblivious to her father's public arrest. She was pacing frantically across the master bedroom floor. She wore a pair of expensive silk pajamas, having decided to stay in for the evening after discovering her credit cards were useless. The master closet, a space previously filled with my husband's stolen luxury items, was a total disaster zone. Mackenzie had 3 large designer suitcases open on the hardwood floor. She was aggressively sweeping dozens of high-end purses from shelves and stuffing them into bags. She had her hands full of iconic Birkin bags, limited edition Chanel crossbodies, and pristine Gucci totes. She was moving with a manic, desperate energy, realizing the financial freeze was not a temporary glitch. She planned to abscond with the most liquid assets remaining. She intended to pawn the stolen leather goods to fund her spoiled lifestyle. She shoved a red leather bag into the suitcase and struggled to pull the zipper closed. Suddenly, the heavy oak front door of the penthouse swung open. A team of 4 uniformed Seattle police officers entered the living room, accompanied by the stern-faced building manager of the Apex Property Group. The manager held a clipboard containing the 48-hour vacate notice we had issued alongside a freshly signed judicial confiscation warrant. The police officers did not knock on the bedroom door. They pushed it wide open, their boots stepping firmly onto the plush white carpet. Mackenzie shrieked, dropping a heavy designer clutch onto the floor. She spun around, her eyes wild with entitlement and sudden terror. She immediately adopted her usual defensive posture, placing hands on hips and shouting at the armed officers. She demanded to know what they were doing, screaming that they were trespassing in her father's private billionaire residence. She threatened to call her father's lawyers and have every single one of them fired and sued for harassment. The lead police officer, a veteran cop, who clearly had zero patience for spoiled teenagers, stepped forward. He did not raise his voice. He calmly handed her the eviction notice. He informed her the legal lease on the property had been permanently terminated due to corporate fraud. He stated she was trespassing on property owned entirely by Vanguard Holdings. Mackenzie ripped the paper from his hands, her eyes scanning the bold print. She shrieked that she lived there and was packing her personal belongings to leave peacefully. She gestured fiercely toward the 3 overflowing suitcases, claiming the bags were her rightful property. The Apex building manager stepped forward, adjusting his tie. He handed the police officer the secondary judicial warrant. The officer looked directly at Mackenzie and informed her the items she was attempting to steal were not gifts. He explained forensic auditors had conclusively proven every designer bag, shoe, and piece of jewelry in that closet had been purchased using embezzled corporate funds. They were illicit assets acquired through federal wire fraud. Mackenzie's arrogant facade completely shattered. The blood drained from her face as 2 officers stepped past her and confiscated the packed suitcases. She lunged forward, grabbing the handle of the largest suitcase, screaming she needed them to pay for college tuition. She sobbed hysterically, pulling against the officer's firm grip. The officer gently but forcefully removed her hands from the luggage. He warned her that interfering with the seizure of illicit assets would result in her immediate arrest for obstruction of justice. She backed away, hands trembling wildly, as she realized she had absolutely no power left. The officers instructed her. She had exactly 2 minutes to gather whatever basic non-designer clothing she needed before she was permanently removed from the premises. Mackenzie was too paralyzed by shock to pack anything else. She simply stood in the center of the ruined closet, weeping uncontrollably as police carried millions of dollars of stolen merchandise out the front door. I watched the tablet screen as officers escorted a sobbing Mackenzie out of the penthouse. She was still wearing thin silk pajamas and a pair of fluffy bedroom slippers. She did not even grab a winter coat. They led her down the marble hallway and into the glass elevator. The descent to the ground floor was silent and suffocating. The lobby concierge, who used to cater to her every obnoxious whim, did not even look up from his desk as she marched past the grand reception area. The glass doors slid open, and the officers directed her out into the freezing Seattle night. The building manager locked the exterior doors, officially sealing the property. The live feed switched to the exterior security cameras. I watched as Mackenzie stood shivering on the cold concrete curb. She hugged her arms tightly across her chest, the chilly wind cutting right through her thin pajamas. She looked up at the towering skyscraper, realizing she was entirely locked out of the only world she had ever known. She sank down onto the hard pavement, burying her face in her hands. There were no luxury cars waiting for her. There were no sycophantic friends coming to rescue her. Her father was sitting in a federal holding cell, and her college fund had been spent on a yacht currently being seized by the government. She was completely alone, stripped of the arrogance and cruelty she wielded like a weapon against me for 3 long years. I handed the secure tablet back to Oliver. We had systematically dismantled an empire of lies and delivered absolute justice. I took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of my cold champagne. The crisp taste of the cold champagne lingered on my palate, a perfect and fitting conclusion to the night I reclaimed my entire existence. The gala arrest and the simultaneous penthouse eviction were only the initial shockwaves of the storm I had unleashed. Over the next 6 weeks, the federal justice system took over the complete demolition of my husband. I did not have to lift another finger or raise my voice. I simply watched from the comfortable distance of my newly secured luxury estate as the authorities systematically dismantled every remaining illusion Preston had ever constructed. The swift and brutal reality of federal incarceration broke him down faster than I could have ever anticipated. He was denied bail due to the extreme flight risk we had proven with Lexi's encrypted flash drive, forcing him to await his ultimate fate in a sterile concrete cell. The final divorce and fraud hearing was scheduled on a bleak, rain-swept Tuesday morning in downtown Seattle. The federal courthouse was an imposing structure of gray stone and heavy mahogany, designed to make every individual inside feel small and insignificant. I walked through the grand double doors of the courtroom, flanked by Oliver and DeAndre. I wore a perfectly tailored navy blue suit that projected absolute authority and calm resilience. We took our seats at the plaintiff table, arranging thick binders of undeniable evidence across the polished wood surface. The gallery behind us was empty, save for a few court reporters who had caught wind of the spectacular tech billionaire fraud case. There were no arrogant venture capitalists to support him. There were no country club friends or sycophantic board members to offer their false sympathies. Even his spoiled daughter Mackenzie had completely abandoned him, having recently moved out of state to live with her biological mother after discovering her trust fund had been spent on a confiscated luxury yacht. Preston was entirely and completely alone. A heavy side door opened with a loud metallic click, and the bailiff led my husband into the courtroom. The sight of him nearly took my breath away, not out of pity, but out of sheer unadulterated shock at his drastic physical degradation. Preston was no longer the slick, fast-talking executive who wore imported Italian silk and leased a new Maserati every single year. He shuffled into the room wearing a bright, oversized orange prison jumpsuit. His wrists were secured in heavy steel handcuffs attached to a thick chain wrapped tightly around his waist. His posture was completely shattered. His shoulders slumped forward, and his once perfectly styled hair was thinning, greasy, and unkempt. The arrogant swagger that had defined his entire personality was entirely eradicated, replaced by the nervous, darting glances of a terrified and cornered animal. I took a seat at the defense table. There was no high-power, expensive defense attorney sitting beside him. The ruthless legal shark his parents had desperately tried to hire had immediately dropped his case, the exact moment they realized every single dime of his wealth was frozen or seized by federal authorities. Because his assets were entirely illicit and tied up in the embezzlement investigation, he simply could not afford private representation. Instead, he was stuck with an overworked, exhausted public defender who looked like he had not slept in 3 days. The public defender did not even look at Preston as he sat down, merely organizing his meager stack of papers with a deep sigh of utter apathy. Preston looked across the aisle at me, his eyes pleading for a mercy he never once extended to me during our marriage. I did not break eye contact, and I did not offer a single fraction of a comforting smile. I simply stared back with the cold, calculating detachment of a majority shareholder watching a terrible investment finally get liquidated. The Honorable Judge, Eleanor Vance, presided over the hearing. She was a veteran federal judge known throughout the district for her absolute intolerance of corporate fraud and financial abuse. She took her seat at the elevated bench, adjusted her silver reading glasses, and looked down at Preston with an expression of profound disgust. The proceedings began with the finalization of our divorce and the dissolution of our shared assets. Because Preston was simultaneously facing severe federal felony charges for wire fraud and embezzlement. The family court and federal financial hearings had been consolidated for judicial efficiency. Oliver stood up, buttoning his bespoke jacket, and addressed the court with his booming, authoritative voice. He did not waste time with theatrical speeches. He simply let the concrete facts do the talking. Oliver presented the undeniable mountain of evidence we had meticulously gathered over the past month. He submitted DeAndre's flawless forensic accounting sweep, which clearly tracked the exact routing of $8 million stolen directly from my holding company to fund Preston's mistress and his daughter's extravagant shopping sprees. He presented the decrypted offshore bank statements exposing Preston's premeditated plan to drain the remaining corporate capital and flee to a luxury sanctuary in Dubai. The public defender did not even attempt to object to the submitted documents. He knew the evidence was absolutely bulletproof. Preston sat frozen in his chair, his head hanging so low his chin nearly touched his chest. But Oliver was far from finished. He picked up a separate red folder and walked it directly to the judge's bench. He presented the fabricated prenuptial amendment Preston had desperately filed during his final days of freedom. Oliver laid out the international travel logs, the stamped Japanese customs records, and the corporate flight manifests, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that I was physically located in Tokyo. On the exact day, Preston claimed I had signed away 50% of my private trust. Judge Vance examined the forged notary stamp and the impossible dates. The silence in the courtroom was terrifyingly heavy. She lowered the documents and fixed her piercing gaze entirely on Preston. She asked him directly if he had willingly submitted this fabricated document to a federal court under the strict penalty of perjury. Preston stammered, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. He tried to claim he was terribly confused, that his previous lawyer had made a massive clerical error, that he never intended to mislead the justice system. He attempted to turn on his old CEO charm, offering a trembling, apologetic smile to the judge, begging for leniency because of the supposed immense stress of the hostile takeover. Judge Vance slammed her wooden gavel down with a deafening crack that echoed off the high stone walls. She silenced his pathetic excuses instantly. She stated that in her 30 years on the federal bench, she had seen many thieves, but she had rarely encountered one so remarkably arrogant and simultaneously incompetent. She explicitly reprimanded him for attempting to weaponize the legal system against the very woman who had secretly funded his entire existence. She noted that forgery was the desperate act of a weak man who had finally run out of lies to tell. The judge did not hesitate in delivering her final ruling. She officially granted the divorce decree, severing all my legal ties to Preston effectively immediately. She ruled heavily in my favor regarding all financial disputes and asset distributions. Because Preston had committed massive fraud using the corporate entity, Judge Vance legally stripped him of his remaining 15% phantom equity in the startup. His shares were completely voided and transferred back to Vanguard Holdings as partial restitution for the stolen capital. Preston was officially left with absolute zero ownership of the company he proudly claimed to have built from scratch. Furthermore, the judge ordered him to pay massive lifelong financial restitution. Every single dollar he ever earned in the future, assuming he could ever find basic employment after serving his mandatory federal prison sentence, would be aggressively garnished to repay the trust he had so callously drained. She ensured he would live the rest of his natural life in the exact state of financial panic he had repeatedly tried to force upon me. Preston began to hyperventilate loudly. He clutched the edge of the defense table, his knuckles turning stark white as the full weight of his total annihilation crushed him. He was completely broke, utterly humiliated, and legally bound to a massive debt he could never possibly repay. Before adjourning the hearing, Judge Vance paused. She folded her hands together and looked down at the trembling man in the orange jumpsuit. She delivered the final devastating blow with perfect judicial clarity. She noted that she had reviewed the initial incident report, detailing the exact moment the corporate asset freeze was triggered. She looked Preston dead in the eye and stated that his entire empire was completely secure until he decided to humiliate his wife in a grocery store. She told him that his sheer unbridled greed and stupidity were staggering. She reprimanded him fiercely, stating that he had triggered a catastrophic federal investigation, lost an $8 million company, and guaranteed his own lengthy incarceration, all because he wanted to play a cruel power game by locking his wife's credit card over a $9.18 gallon of milk. Preston squeezed his eyes shut as the judge's words pierced through his remaining shreds of ego. The realization that his own petty abusive need for absolute control had directly caused his ruin was a poison he would have to swallow every single day in his concrete cell. He could not afford the milk, and now he was paying with his entire future. The judge struck the gavel one final time, declaring the matter officially resolved. The armed bailiffs stepped forward, grabbing Preston firmly by his upper arms and hauling him to his feet. As they turned him around to lead him back to the holding cells, he looked at me one last time. There was no anger left in his expression, only a profound, hollow despair. I did not smile. I did not gloat or offer a parting insult. I simply stood up, smoothed my tailored charcoal jacket, and turned my back on him forever. I walked out of the heavy mahogany doors into the bright Seattle morning, flanked by the brilliant team who had helped me secure my absolute freedom. The air outside tasted exceptionally clean, and the vast, unwritten future belonged entirely to me. 6 weeks later, that future solidified into absolute permanence as the federal justice system delivered its final verdict on my former husband. The sentencing hearing lacked the theatricality of our divorce proceedings. It was a swift, clinical execution of justice that stripped away the last remaining shreds of his manufactured billionaire facade. Preston stood before the judge wearing the same oversized orange jumpsuit, his posture broken, and his eyes fixed firmly on the polished wood of the defense table. The federal prosecutor painted a devastating picture of corporate greed, meticulously detailing how Preston had systematically embezzled millions of dollars to fund a lifestyle he could never legitimately afford. When the judge handed down a sentence of 87 months in a federal penitentiary, Preston did not argue. He did not attempt to charm the courtroom or offer a pathetic apology. He simply closed his eyes as the heavy reality of 7 years behind bars finally crushed the delusion he had cultivated for a decade. The armed bailiffs escorted him out through a side door, sealing his fate. He was no longer a visionary tech founder or a respected executive. He was federal inmate number 48209, assigned to a medium security facility in eastern Washington. His days of leasing luxury cars, commanding boardrooms, and humiliating others over discount groceries were permanently replaced by strict routines, terrible food, and absolute powerlessness. The empire he built on my capital was erased, and his name became a cautionary tale whispered in the Seattle financial district. His ultimate destruction was secured not just by my forensic audit, but by the devastating testimony of the very woman he had planned to flee with. Lexi took the witness stand during the evidentiary phase of the trial, looking entirely different from the arrogant executive assistant who had stormed into the cafe demanding her allowance. To avoid a lengthy prison sentence for her role as an accessory to wire fraud, she accepted a total immunity deal from the federal prosecutors. The cost of her freedom was her public reputation. Under oath, Lexi confessed every single detail of their illicit arrangement. She detailed the stolen corporate funds used to secure her luxury condo, the fake vendor accounts that paid for her designer wardrobe, and the premeditated escape plan to Dubai. The local media seized upon the scandalous testimony, broadcasting her face across every news network and social platform in the city. Her carefully curated influencer image was instantly obliterated. The wealthy social circles she had desperately climbed into immediately shunned her, treating her like a toxic liability. Stripped of the stolen corporate funds and facing immense public backlash, Lexi had absolutely nowhere else to go. She was forced to pack whatever basic clothing she had left and move back into her childhood bedroom in her parents' modest suburban home. The luxury high-rise life she thought she had secured was replaced by a tiny twin bed and the profound disappointment of her working-class parents. She spent her days hiding indoors, terrified of being recognized at the local grocery store, completely abandoned by the man who had promised her the world. While Preston adjusted to a concrete cell and Lexi vanished into suburban obscurity, Mackenzie faced the harshest reality check of all. For 18 years, she had existed in a bubble of extreme privilege, shielded from the consequences of her horrific behavior by a father who handed her a premium credit card whenever she threw a tantrum. When my trust liquidated the holding company and seized the stolen assets, that bubble popped with violent force. The police had confiscated her designer bags at the penthouse, leaving her with nothing but a single suitcase of basic clothing. She initially attempted to crash on the couches of her wealthy friends, spinning a dramatic story about a temporary family misunderstanding. However, once the news of her father's federal indictment broke and the magnitude of his embezzlement became public knowledge, those friends quickly stopped returning her calls. The elite social circles she used to rule had zero tolerance for the daughter of a convicted fraudster who had stolen money from their own venture capital networks. Mackenzie was forced to move into a cramped, noisy apartment with 3 college students she barely knew sleeping on a lumpy futon in the living room. The reality of her financial situation hit her rapidly. She had no trust fund, no college savings, and absolutely zero marketable skills. The fake summer internship her father had gifted her provided no actual work experience, leaving her resume entirely blank. Her premium cell phone plan was terminated, forcing her to buy a cheap prepaid device. When she could no longer afford her share of the rent or basic groceries, she had to do something she had previously considered beneath her. She had to find a minimum wage job. She applied to several upscale retail boutiques in the downtown shopping district, arrogantly assuming her prior experience as a customer would guarantee her a management position. The store managers took one look at her terrible attitude and blank work history and promptly showed her the door. Desperation eventually drove her to a busy commercial intersection on the edge of the city, miles away from the glamorous boutiques she used to frequent. Mackenzie walked into a fast food burger franchise, swallowed the last remaining drop of her immense pride, and filled out a paper application. She was hired on the spot to work the afternoon register shift. Her new reality began the following Monday. Instead of the designer dresses and expensive jewelry she used to flaunt, Mackenzie was forced to wear a garish bright yellow polyester uniform polo shirt and a matching visor that flattened her hair. A thick plastic name tag was pinned to her chest. The job was physically demanding and completely humiliating. She spent her hours standing under harsh fluorescent lights, her hands smelling of stale frying oil and cheap cleaning chemicals. She had to smile and politely take orders from construction workers, exhausted parents, and teenagers from her old high school, who occasionally recognized her and snickered behind their hands. The girl who had once violently kicked my work bag and demanded I wire $10,000 to fix her luxury car. Deposit was now sweeping spilled French fries off a sticky linoleum floor for $12 an hour. Every time she handed a greasy paper bag through the drive-through window, she received a painful lesson in the actual value of a single dollar. She learned how long she had to stand on her aching feet just to afford a basic bus ticket back to her miserable apartment. She learned that the world did not care about her complaints or her past status. She was just another replaceable employee at the bottom of the economic ladder. One particularly brutal Friday afternoon, Mackenzie was assigned to the exterior cleanup duty. She grabbed a heavy push broom and a plastic dustpan, dragging her feet as she walked out into the sweltering heat of the parking lot. She wore her bright yellow visor pulled low over her face, desperately hoping no one would notice her scraping crushed ketchup packets off the hot asphalt. Her bright white sneakers were stained with grease, and she was sweating profusely through her thick uniform shirt. As she bent down to empty the dustpan into a large concrete trash receptacle, a low, powerful engine rumble caught her attention. She looked up, shielding her eyes from the bright afternoon sun. A brand new, sleek, midnight black Aston Martin pulled smoothly into the intersection, pausing at the red light directly in front of the fast food restaurant. The car was a masterpiece of modern engineering, radiating the kind of stealth wealth and untouchable success her father had always desperately tried to fake. The tinted driver's side window slowly rolled down. I sat behind the leather-wrapped steering wheel, wearing a pair of dark designer sunglasses and a crisp white silk blouse. I was on my way to a high-level board meeting to officially absorb the remnants of Preston's company into Vanguard Holdings. I turned my head slightly, looking directly across the parking lot. Mackenzie froze the plastic dustpan slipping from her greasy fingers and clattering loudly onto the asphalt. Her eyes widened in absolute shock as she recognized me. She stood perfectly still in her garish yellow uniform, holding a dirty broom completely exposed in her humiliating new reality. I did not glare at her. I did not offer a condescending wave or a cruel smirk. I simply looked at her with the calm, indifferent expression of a woman who had successfully removed a piece of trash from her life. The traffic light turned green. I smoothly accelerated the Aston Martin, the powerful engine roaring, as I drove past the restaurant without looking back. Through my rearview mirror, I watched Mackenzie standing paralyzed by the trash cans. Her shoulders slumped forward in total defeat, her face twisting into an ugly mask of profound, seething regret as she finally understood the absolute permanence of what she had thrown away. The exhaust fumes dissipated into the warm city air, leaving her trapped in the greasy minimum wage prison she had built for herself, while I continued driving forward into the brilliant, unburdened future I had meticulously secured. The dust had finally settled over the beautiful Seattle skyline, and the stunning view from my brand new corporate office was absolutely spectacular. I proudly stood before the massive windows of the newly rebranded Vanguard Holdings headquarters, gazing out at the sprawling, vibrant city far below me. The ultra-modern corporate suite was a beautiful testament to the massive empire I had quietly reclaimed. Sleek, polished glass partitions entirely replaced the stifling, oppressive mahogany walls of the past, and bright natural light flooded every single corner of the executive floor. There were no rented luxury cars waiting. There were no fake billionaires pacing these pristine halls. This towering building, this incredibly profitable company, and this entire reality belonged entirely to me. I took a long, deep breath, inhaling the crisp, conditioned air of absolute autonomy. For 3 long years, I had purposefully minimized my own daily existence, hiding myself completely. I was deliberately hiding my massive wealth and my sharp intellect just to stroke the fragile ego of a man who ultimately tried to destroy me. I had worn plain beige sweaters and driven a rattling car, foolishly convincing myself that humility would automatically buy me some genuine lasting affection from him. Instead, my silence had only bought me relentless disrespect and profound betrayal. Now I proudly wore a perfectly tailored ivory silk suit that projected undeniable, untouchable authority. The transition from the quiet, unseen archivist to the highly active majority shareholder and chief executive officer had been incredibly swift and merciless. The corporate board of directors, the few intelligent men who had wisely remained after the spectacular downfall, now reported directly to me. They had quickly learned that the quiet woman they once foolishly laughed at over a boardroom speakerphone was an entirely different kind of predator in person. The massive corporate transition had been perfectly seamless, primarily because the deep financial rot inflicted upon the company was surgically removed by my dedicated team. The hidden offshore accounts were fully recovered, the fake vendor contracts were permanently terminated, and the tech company was finally operating with genuine transparency completely. The dark, suffocating cloud of relentless gaslighting and financial abuse had completely evaporated, leaving behind a pristine, highly lucrative slate. I turned away from the breathtaking window and walked purposefully toward my massive new desk, a beautiful heavy slab of polished reclaimed black walnut resting securely right before me. My fingertips gently across the smooth, cool surface, a wonderful tactile reminder of the incredibly solid foundation I had successfully built. The terrible noise and overwhelming chaos of the past few months had been entirely, permanently muted. There were no more frantic, desperate phone calls from angry local creditors everywhere. There were no more screaming entitled tantrums from a severely spoiled stepdaughter, and absolutely no more humiliating public encounters designed to break my spirit. My new life was a beautiful symphony of flawless precision and absolute control. I sat down gracefully in my plush, ergonomic leather chair, feeling perfectly supported. The absolute silence in the spacious room was not lonely at all. It was profoundly, deeply powerful. It was the unmistakable sound of a brilliant woman who had successfully navigated a treacherous labyrinth of deceit and emerged entirely unscathed, holding all the keys. The heavy frosted glass door smoothly opened. The door swung open with a soft, elegant glide. My wonderful sister Nicole walked in, her bright, genuine smile lighting up the entire room, followed closely by her brilliant husband, DeAndre. DeAndre proudly carried a heavy bottle of vintage premium champagne, the shiny gold foil catching the bright afternoon sunlight. They were the beautiful found family. I had always desperately needed the true, steadfast allies who had stood firmly by my side when the dangerous battle lines were officially drawn. Nicole quickly approached my desk and leaned over, planting a very warm, loving kiss gently on my right cheek today. She wore a stunning, vibrant crimson dress, looking infinitely happier and significantly more relaxed than I had seen her in several long years. DeAndre gently set the chilled champagne bottle on the smooth edge of my walnut desk, his tailored charcoal suit impeccable as always, his sharp, intelligent eyes dancing. He smoothly produced 3 delicate crystal flutes from a small protective velvet box he had brought with him, carefully setting them down with highly practiced, elegant grace. We honestly did not need a specific excuse to celebrate, but today was particularly undeniably special. The final, binding legal corporate documents dissolved. The documents permanently dissolving the remaining toxic ties to the old corporate entity had been officially filed and permanently sealed that very morning. The financial and personal erasure was absolutely complete. DeAndre expertly popped the heavy cork, the deeply satisfying loud sound echoing wonderfully through the vast, completely quiet space. He poured the bright, bubbling golden liquid perfectly into the 3 crystal flutes, gently handing one to Nicole and one directly to me. We proudly raised our glasses together in the exact center of the beautiful room. Nicole offered a beautiful, heartfelt toast to bright new beginnings, to absolute freedom. To absolute, undeniable freedom, and to the strongest, most resilient woman she had ever known. Our crystal glasses clinked together, producing a bright, clear, melodic chime that felt exactly like the joyful ringing of a victorious bell. I took a slow, savoring sip of the beautifully chilled vintage champagne slowly, letting the crisp, highly complex flavors completely wash over my extremely grateful, deeply satisfied palate. It tasted exactly like pure, unadulterated vindication. I carefully set my glass down and looked directly at DeAndre. He had been the brilliant architectural mind behind the flawless financial trap that successfully ensnared my husband. His incredible forensic accounting skills had quickly exposed the massive embezzlement, the secret offshore accounts, and the young mistress's expensive luxury condo. He had commanded the hostile boardroom with terrifying, absolute authority and ruthlessly protected my massive assets with unyielding, fierce loyalty. I confidently walked around my large wooden desk. I casually leaned against the front edge, crossing my arms over my chest. I told DeAndre that Vanguard Holdings was officially entering a massive phase of highly aggressive global expansion. I explained clearly that I desperately needed a trusted executive team that consistently operated with absolute flawless precision and integrity. I officially named DeAndre the new Chief Financial Officer of my incredibly powerful, newly restructured venture capital firm, right there. I offered him an unprecedented compensation package that immediately quadrupled his current salary, complete with a substantial lucrative equity stake in the primary holding company and absolute autonomous executive control. I thanked him sincerely for his unwavering beautiful loyalty for his brilliant mind always, and for bravely standing directly in the intense line of fire when the corporate war first began. DeAndre looked quietly at the heavy legal contract I slid carefully across the smooth wooden desk. He did not even bother to read the massive numbers printed boldly on the pristine white pages. He simply pulled his signature silver pen from his tailored suit jacket pocket and confidently signed his name on the dotted line with an incredibly smooth, highly decisive flourish. He looked up at me proudly smiling. He officially accepted the prestigious new position, promising faithfully that Vanguard Holdings would rapidly become an untouchable, dominant corporate fortress under our newly combined, highly aggressive leadership. Nicole happily hugged him tightly, genuine tears of pure joy shining brightly in her beautiful eyes. The unbreakable alliance was permanently wonderfully forged in dark ink and vintage premium champagne. We spent the next highly productive hour enthusiastically discussing the incredibly aggressive corporate acquisition strategies we would ruthlessly deploy in the rapidly approaching financial quarter. The creative energy in the spacious room was absolutely electric, vibrating intensely with thrilling, undeniable rush potential. When the antique grandfather clock resting in the far corner deeply chimed 5 exactly, I decided firmly it was finally time to quietly leave. I neatly packed my extremely sleek, expensive leather briefcase, warmly hugged my loving sister and my brilliant new chief financial officer, and proudly walked away completely today. I walked out of the gorgeous glass office and took the private elevator down to my sleek Aston Martin. The drive through downtown Seattle felt entirely different than it had months ago. The city belonged to me now. A specific destination formed in my mind, a purely symbolic, necessary journey. I pulled into the bustling parking lot of the exact same Whole Foods market. I walked directly to the dairy aisle, reaching into the cold refrigerated case. I pulled out a simple, heavy gallon of organic milk. I carried the plastic jug toward the front registers, spotting the exact same cashier from that fateful Tuesday morning. She scanned the barcode. $9.18. I slid my solid metal black card inside. Approved. Leaving a massive tip, I proudly stepped outside into the bright sunshine, deeply breathing the crisp, clean air of absolute undeniable freedom, completely reclaiming